Hello, everybody, and welcome to Muddy River News This Week, furnished by Harvey's. I'm Bob Gough. My guest today is Reg Ankrom. His company is called CIMAC, but he is also an energy consultant working with the City of Quincy. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
All right, everybody in town's got these letters from Constellation. What about our energy? What about my MRN bills? My MRN bills have gone up so much over the last year or so anyway. What does it all mean?
Yeah. Well, the state some years back passed a program that allows communities to pool all electric usage among small businesses and residents of their community. And the idea was that it would be open to the open market, unregulated, and we would get bids in a competitive action for our communities. And it has generally worked. There have been a couple of times where something intervened. For example, there was a year in which the legislature passed a huge subsidy for an Illinois utility which reduced capacity charges. They went to the floor, and that caused Ameren's price to drop while ours was fixed for the period. So we let people know about that. But the whole idea is to inject competition into electric pricing. And it has worked. We just recently got a price because we found an optimal period in the market. Rates have been exceedingly high, so much so that a year ago we recommended to the city and our other community clients that they suspend their programs for 1 year to see if we could get better pricing. And we found that opportunity in February.
So again, with this plan, you're in it unless you opt out, correct?
Yes, it is an opt-out program by law, and people have the right to opt out at any time. The letters from Constellation are required by law too to notify people that they will be the new supplier for the program. And anytime a rate changes, they're required to notify customers of that change. In our particular case, we got a contract for the City of Quincy, which will run 18 months starting in April. So we'll run till October of 2024, and the prices will be fixed during that time.
So when the prices are fixed, and the prices are generally fixed for a rate that is less than the Ameren average?
Actually less than Ameren's rate. In this particular case, we're slightly above the Ameren rate, but our expectation is that because of a couple of factors, it actually will fall below Ameren's rate. Ameren, at least twice a year, is permitted by regulators to adjust their rates. The next rate adjustment will occur in June. They had one in December, so every 6 months. And our expectation, based on everything we see in the market, is that Ameren's rates will be going up. Ameren's current rate is 11.833 cents. The rate we got was just over 12 cents, so minimal difference, but it is in fact higher. The other thing I was mentioning, besides that annual adjustment where we expect Ameren's rate to go above the city's rate, for the past 7 months, the utility has been passing along what's called a purchase electric adjustment. And that tells us a number of things, and that was one of the reasons we got into the market. The first thing it tells us is there's not enough supply to serve demand in the area. And we know from an economic standpoint that whenever supply is limited for demand, which has been growing in the past 3 years, we see higher prices. Limited supply for increasing demand produces higher prices. So the purchase electric adjustment has been going up, and if we included that, which we typically don't because it's not part of the fixed rate, right, but it is paid by Ameren customers, the Ameren price would be above the city's price.
When I first went to work for the state a few years ago, my first job was with the ICC. So I dealt with a lot of this stuff. We also saw a lot of these companies who would come in who would not have the best reputations, and the ICC would try to weed those out. Is part of your job with the city to also make sure, hey, Constellation's good, they're on the up and up, as opposed to some of these other people who we've seen come in and out?
Yes, we in fact do vet our suppliers. We have dealt with 5 major suppliers. A couple right now aren't participating in the market simply because it's so volatile. It has been so volatile. But we vet our suppliers. They have to be certified by the Commerce Commission and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for us to give them the opportunity to bid on our RFPs, requests for proposals. So we vet them. We look at how much excess capacity they have on their system. We want generation by them. We don't want second party generators, because usually if we ran into a problem, and we're getting tighter and tighter all the time, primary customers are going to get the first service. And so we don't want to put our communities in a position where they're a secondary receiver of electricity. We want them to have the ability to get power anytime they want and any amounts they want. So,
and if a customer decides they want to opt out and they see the market change again, they can opt back in, correct?
If they do so within 2 months.
Okay.
So they can opt out at any time. Constellation's letter says they have a deadline of March 9th to opt out. That's only so Constellation can give Ameren the actual list that they will use for people to participate. But people still can opt out March 10th or the afternoon of March 9th or September 30th. Opt out at any time for any reason at no cost.
Let's kind of talk. I mean, you've been in the business a long time. You worked for Ameren for years before, retired and doing your own company now. Let's kind of talk about how we have gotten to this position, especially with Illinois and having to deal with the grid. Explain to people a little bit of going to the grid, and of course Illinois had to deal with supply, the grid and PJM and the other parts of the grid. Talk to me about how Illinois is affected by that in the big picture.
Yeah, there is what's called an independent system operator whose job is to get power from a generating plant to the major bulk substations of Quincy, for example, and that independent system operator takes advantage of all of the assets around. Number one, the transmission assets. It decides where the power will flow, and it will decide where the power will come from. And so that's the independent system operator. In this area, it's called MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. There is also what's called the Illinois Power Agency. Now, MISO takes care of moving power around the grid. The grid is a series of interconnected lines and switches and so on to get power from one place to another in the most efficient and economical way possible. So that's MISO's role. The Illinois Power Agency is designed to procure power for companies like Ameren, which sold all of its generation assets in 2013, which leads to another problem, which was those were coal-fired plants, and Illinois is basically shutting down fossil-fueled facilities. And so when Ameren served its 1.5 million customers in 65 rural counties in Illinois, they had 5 plants to do that. 4 of those plants are now shuttered. The problem is there's been nothing to replace them. We've been trying as a state, providing incentives to replace through energy conservation or solar or wind or that sort of thing, but it just hasn't kept up with the plants that have been shuttered. I will say that utilities like my own company, Ameren, had known for a long time that there was a requirement to do so. Sure. And they got a number of extensions, and when the final extension came and they weren't allowed to extend any longer, they simply sold their plants. And so, we're running into a number of issues which are creating shortages. And we predict that we're going to see continuing increases in prices until the supply catches up with the demand. The coefficients, the curves are wide apart at this point.
And the state has also shuttered nuclear plants as well.
It has, but it's also protected nuclear plants. Right. That was one of the issues a few years ago, right, when the state, after a number of years, would not fund a subsidy for Commonwealth Edison. Right. Decided to do so when Commonwealth Edison said they depended on that subsidy, sure, to keep 2 nuclear plants open and 6,000 jobs. Yeah. And it made sense from the state's economy to do that, right, but it created chaos and volatility, yeah, in the energy market.
So are we going to get to a point where everybody can stick a wind turbine in their front yard and solar panels on their roofs? How are we going to get through this?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and I think you've just provided a couple of the answers. One is solar, and solar really, I have to admit, I don't know that much about it, but I do know that there's a relationship between the utility and the customer or the consumer who's putting solar, for example, on his or her roof. Mm-hmm. And the way it works, as I understand it, is there's a true-up period at the end of a year where the utility will take a look at the number of kilowatt hours that the person used, and then it will take a look at how many of those kilowatt hours the person himself generated through that solar. And then if that generation was higher than the amount of power that was paid for in the bill, that individual will get a credit on the bill for its solar. So the use of solar is actually helping the utilities. Of course, Ameren really doesn't care one way or another. I mean, I'm sure it cares. Sure. I remember it cared as far as, its community mindedness. But on the other hand, it has no generation. It has nothing to lose with solar. It has nothing to gain with solar. So it's perfectly happy. And I think incentivizes solar as well. So solar is very important. I think wind is important. There's a number of questions about it, which I don't want to go into simply because I'd like people to look at it themselves and make their own decisions. Yeah. My preference is not to convince people to or against.
With when you look at, like you said, Illinois' energy policy.
Yeah.
And take a look at and again, it can kind of maybe be a red state, blue state thing, where the red states, the Missouris of the world, or West Virginia, places where coal can be still produced and they can still burn coal. Do we get to a place where maybe those states continue to do so and then sell power to the states that are not doing that anymore?
Sure. I mean, that's the benefit or the disadvantage, I guess you could say, if you look at it that way, of the grid. I remember when I was with Ameren, we were interconnected with 17 utilities, Indiana, Kentucky, even Ohio and on west. And it was a very beautiful system because what would happen is the computer system would analyze where the next least expensive kilowatt hour could be generated and can be purchased, taking into account there's actually what's called line loss. There's a bit of loss of the oomph in power the farther it's transported. So the dispatch center, which was in Pana, Illinois, could analyze, we can get power for 3 cents per kilowatt hour from Kentucky utilities. Our system analyzed the heat value in coal, for example, and we couldn't generate on our system a kilowatt hour for less than 3.1 cents. Mm-hmm. So the computer would suggest or actually work to obtain the Kentucky utility power at 3 cents rather than generating on our system for 3.1. The beauty of that was it saved the customer that money.
Sure.
So interconnected systems allow that to happen, whether that generating plant in Kentucky is using coal or oil or natural gas, whatever it might be using. If it's on the system and it's producing the next cheapest kilowatt hour, that's where the system is generally going to get it.
Okay, so just to wrap up again with the letters that people got, they have a deadline of March 9th, but it's not really a deadline.
It's not a deadline for them. It's a deadline for Constellation to tell Ameren that these are its customers.
Okay.
Again, Bob, opt out at any time.
Sure.
For no reason at all, at no cost.
All right. Well, thanks for the discussion, and we'll probably touch back on this issue, I'm sure, down the road.
Sure. Happy to do it.
All right. That's Reg Ankrom. I'm Bob Gough for Muddy River News This Week. Have a great week.